Hi everyone, my name is Shelby, and today we are going to be continuing with our three-part River of Change series, and we will be focusing on the Rio Manso. Okay, so we are here in the Rio Manso, and we are going to be learning about what the river was 2,000 years ago, and then how it changed to being what it looks like today in the present. So let's get going. So you saw these pictures in our previous lesson, and we're going to continue look at them. So this first picture here is from the 1930s. It is taken by aviator Charles Lindbergh, and it is actually in Albuquerque. It is showing the shape of the river and how it meanders and curves and braids, and it's really wide. And then we have our recent photo here. So our recent photo here, you can see the river is very straight. There's not nearly as many bends in it. There's a few, but not many. There's a lot less braids in it as well. So you can see that the shape of it is very different. And we're going to continue on this second question that says, what do you think happened to the Rio Grande and its bosque to make it look like that? So before we get into that, let's do a recap of part one. So in part one, we have our Sandia Mountains, and if you are in Albuquerque, those Sandia Mountains would be in the east. We have the mesas and volcanoes on the other side of the river, which are in the west. And then to the north of New Mexico and Albuquerque is Colorado, and that is like the birthplace of the Rio Grande. It is where snow packs during the winter time. That snowpack melts in the spring and then creates our river. And then it flows all the way down through New Mexico and Texas and Mexico, and then ends up down south in the Gulf of Mexico. So a major driver of the bosque is flooding. And these cottonwood trees that are on here rely heavily on this flooding. So we have cottonwoods that are reproducing every single year, and it is in the form of this cottonwood fluff. If you've seen it in the spring, it looks kind of like it's snowing, but that cottonwood fluff is carrying seeds. And this flooding is really important for these seeds to germinate and to grow. So we need both of them to happen we need both of them to happen almost at the exact same time so that they're able to sprout. So now that we've had some of our cottonwood seedlings, they're able to sprout, and then they're able to turn into cottonwood saplings, which are like the teenager cottonwoods. And then every year, while that same cycle is happening of the river flooding, there's cottonwood fluff that's carrying seeds that are germinating, and then we have cottonwood seedlings growing and turning into saplings, and there's still adults around. That whole cycle is happening all at once. So that's what's kind of being shown here. We have our saplings here that were growing from years past, at the same time that these adults are continuing to put out cottonwood fluff and seeds that are going to continue to be germinated and continue to grow. So we have our seedlings here, we have our saplings and our adults. There's constantly going to be those three stages of life for cottonwoods in the bosque at all times. We always have our seedlings, we have our saplings, and we have our adults. So in the fall and the winter time, when it's normally snowing up in the mountains, especially in Colorado, is when that snow would be building up. So there wouldn't be as much water flowing through the river during that time. So the river would retreat and it might change shape during that time. So that was a big feature within the bosque, is there was that flooding in the spring and the summer, and then it would retreat down and then leave a totally different shape from what it was before. And that is how we got that meandering shape, that braided shape from those constant changes. Other features that we have within our bosque are riparian shrubs. And so these are like the middle level trees, kind of. They can be New Mexico olives, or they can be different kinds of willows that can grow within this area. And they are all native. They have been here for a long time, and they are from New Mexico. Other plants are cattails. I think that these kind of look like a corn dog. And these cattails, they can only grow near water. They have to have water to be able to survive. So they need to be near the river in order to grow, or near ponds to grow. And then up higher in the mountains and the areas that might not get as much water, like in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains or in the mesas where it's primarily dry, we have other plants that are called upland shrubs, and these can be things like cacti or four-winged saltbush, anything like that that doesn't need nearly as much water to survive. These are plants that can survive just by rainwater. They don't need flooding or just a constant source of water to survive. And then we have lots of animals that live in the bosque too. We have coyotes and porcupines and geese and eagles and a lot of different amphibians and reptiles and birds and fish. All of them are living in the bosque and able to survive there. So now we're going to be looking at how do we get from the past, from what we just talked about, to more recent times and the recent look of this bosque. So that's what we're going to explore today and see what changes were made to make it look different. And to do that, we are going to be going through this timeline here. And it's going to lead us through from 1600 years ago to present, so that we can see really big events that happened within our timeline to change the bosque and to make it look like it does now. The first thing we're going to be talking about is 1600 years ago, we had the first known Puebloan permanent settlements. So let's add some pueblos onto our map. So we have pueblos here, and these were permanent settlements, which meant that they were able to grow their own food here at the same time. So we also have some agriculture fields that they are able to grow crops on to survive in this area. And you can see they're near the mountains, they're near the river, and everywhere in between. They're kind of spread out throughout the whole area. And then 750 years ago, so they had quite a long time in between to figure out their space, get their crops and their homes all where they need to be. But then 750 years ago, there was major droughts in the Southwest, which meant that the river and the Rio Grande and its bosque became a main focus for Puebloan settlements. So there was active water there. They were able to water their crops and use the water for themselves as well. So being near the water was very important to them. So we are going to add more homes right near the bosque, and maybe the ones that were further away from the bosque weren't able to survive as easily, so they migrated towards the bosque as well. 400 years ago is when we started seeing a lot of Spanish colonizers beginning to settle in New Mexico. And during that time, they were not nice to the Puebloan people. So the Puebloan people, they were aimed to reclaim their religious practices, their culture and land, which led to the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. So let's talk a little bit about that. There were many things that led to the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. So this says that the Pueblo people and their religion, economics, and political beliefs were suppressed by Spanish settlers. And in the 1670s, many of these people were ordered to be killed by the Spanish governor of New Mexico at the time. And many Puebloans, including a holy man and captain, Popey of Ocoyawinge Pueblo, he fought back and led a revolt with other Puebloan people against the Spaniards. This revolt was successful, and it kept Spanish settlers out of New Mexico for 12 years. The Indian Pueblo Cultural Center here in Albuquerque, when they were speaking about this, they said, "The Pueblo Revolt holds great historical significance because it helps ensure the survival of Pueblo cultural traditions, lands, languages, religions, and sovereignty." With the Europeans coming in and also having the revolt, that meant that the population of the Pueblo people went down, unfortunately. So we had to remove some of these Pueblos and add more of these European homes in. And then that leads us to 1706, which is when Albuquerque was founded, but it was founded by the Spanish colonizers. They were people who lived here beforehand, the Puebloan people who lived here already. It wasn't until the Spaniards came in that it was officially named Albuquerque. So we're going to add more European homes onto our model. And then this is where things start to shift a lot, and we really get changes in our bosque and our river and what the shape of it looks like, and just the overall ecosystem really changes here. So between the 1870s and the 1940s, there's a lot of things that happen, and that is there are large floods that occur. There's population that increases. There's overgrazing from crops that and animals that people had brought in from Europe, which leads to erosion and more sediments in the river. And then they also bring over some garden plants like salt cedar and Russian olive, which then spread into the bosque and continue to flourish there. So that's where some of the introduction of our exotic plants is. So there was a lot that happened there, so let's go through them a little bit. We have large floods that happened. We have a population increase. We have erosion and an increased sediment in the river. And we also have the introduction of exotic plants. So let's look at some of those a little bit more in depth. So we have our exotic plants, and these exotic plants are salt cedars and Russian olives, and they're able to do really well in this environment. And then we have large floods in the 1870s to the 1920s as well. So we have tons of water coming in the area, and let's look a little bit about what a flood is. All right, so here is a video here of some floods, and you could see the water is moving really quickly down this area, and also it's picking up a lot of debris along the way. It's picking up logs that had been down, it's moving super quickly and spreading widely into the area. That is very similar to what happened in our bosque when it would flood as well. So we have water that has expanded from these large floods, and let's see what has happened as a result of those large floods. So I have circled some features here. We have some pueblos, we have some European homes, and some agricultural fields as well. So what do you think would happen to those items that I had circled during those floods? They could either A, they would stay the same, B, they would get damaged, C, they might float away, or B, they would have minimal damage. They would definitely get damaged by this flood, just like today that we've seen before with hurricanes and other weather events. Flooding does a lot of damage on homes. So that is what they had seen with the flooding in the bosque as well, because you couldn't predict where it would go. It would just flow wherever it wanted to, and if there was a lot of water coming down the river during that time, then you had no idea where that water was going to go. They got damaged and most likely were not able to be rebuilt, so those are going to go. And I mean, I wouldn't like to have my home being constantly damaged by water, or me constantly having to fix it, or constantly having to rebuild it, or relocate myself and maybe my family. What are some solutions to prevent flooding damage on homes that you can come up with? So that leads us to our next point. In the 1920s, we had levees and ditches that were constructed to limit flooding. So let's get into both of those two, the levees and the ditches, and see kind of what those are. So our first solution is levees. And what levees are is it's basically just a mound of dirt that has been put up to kind of act like a wall to catch the water. And this levee here in Albuquerque and other places throughout New Mexico, levees are a great place for people to go walking. They ride their bikes there. It's a place where a lot of people go to just be outdoors. And in this graphic here, you can kind of see like a cross section of what the river and the bosque would look like. So in the middle, we have our river. Either side, we have the bosque. And then we have these levees, which I said were like piles of dirt with a path on top of them. So when it would flood, the levees would be able to catch that water. It would kind of act just like a bowl and catch the water, so it wasn't able to get to the homes that were outside of the levee. So now that we have the levees that have been implemented to catch some of that water from flooding over and damaging the homes, what do you think will happen to the river? What do you think the shape of the river will be? Do you think it will straighten, or do you think it will stay the same and continue to be meandering and curvy? So as a result of having these levees in, it will end up straightening because it doesn't have the wide extent of land to be able to flood onto. So our river is constricted by these levees. However, some years these floods were even too big for the levees, and the water would go up and over the levees and continue to damage homes in areas outside of the levees. So they needed another solution to this flooding because the levees just weren't enough. There was still some water from floods getting over the levees and damaging their spaces. So that leads us to our solution 2, which is ditches. So before we start talking about ditches, I want to ask you a quick question. What would happen to the water that goes over the levee? Here's a picture of a ditch, and it's basically just a trench that is dug in the ground that catches a lot of water, and then it starts diverting it either to other areas of the river or to agricultural fields to be able to water their crops. And back to this cross section that we had worked on earlier, we have our flooded bosque here. So we have our river in the middle, our bosque on either side, and then our levee. But then sometimes that water goes up and over the levee, and having that ditch there is able to catch that water. It's able to divert it somewhere else so that it doesn't damage any homes and goes where they want it to, like their crops or back into the river and other areas. So we have our ditches in place, which also contributes to a straightening of the river. So we have these big features that were built. We have the ditches that were completely dug out of the ground. We have our levees, which are huge piles of dirt and rocks to kind of make a mound. So having those big features that were built in the bosque, what do you think would happen to these features that are circled here? We have some cottonwood seedlings, there's some saplings, we have these oxbow lakes that are on the outside. So there's all of those features on the outside or on the levees and the ditches. So what would happen to these features that I circled now that the levees and ditches are installed? Unfortunately, they would go away because putting in the levee and the ditches was some major construction, and it also meant that water didn't get outside of them. So whatever seedlings were outside, whatever saplings were outside, were not able to get enough water. And then eventually the oxbow lakes dried up, or ponds, they all dried up as well. So there wasn't enough water outside of the levee and ditch for these trees and plants and features to survive. In 1941, we have one last really good flood in the river, and it floods over the levees. And this time we were able to get some of the last cottonwoods that sprouted. So a lot of the cottonwoods that you see today in the bosque are from this flood. So we have our bosque, and it starts flooding, and it goes over the levees. And then we have cottonwoods that are still producing their seeds no matter what. As long as there's adults, they hopefully will produce these seeds. And then it's flooding as well, so they have plenty of water to be able to grow. And then we have our seedlings starting up, which is great. And then after that flood, in 1951, we had jetty jacks that were placed along the riverbank to control debris when it was flooding. So let's look at that a little bit. Although we had some flooding still occurring, it wasn't as regular as it had been previously. So a lot of the plants and trees did not get as much water as they needed to survive, which unfortunately meant that they died. And when we have those dead trees, they're a lot easier to knock down, or they fall over in windstorms, which means that we have more logs and just dead plant material that is on the ground. So when we do have those floods, they flow down the river, and they could damage the levees because, like I said, the levees are just made out of piles of dirt and rocks. So they're easy to damage if a giant log starts going down the river that's flooding. It can damage it. Or if the flooding is large enough and it goes over the levees, it could damage homes by carrying those logs over the edge. So to help with that, we have implemented some things called jetty jacks. And these are just giant like metal X's that have wires running through them, and it catches any debris like these dead logs that is floating down the river and helps them to not damage the levees or go over the levees and damage people's homes. So these were here to just catch all of this debris. So now we have our jetty jacks that were implemented in our bosque. And then in 1965 to 1975, some people decided that they still needed to control the river a little bit more because some areas maybe had been a little bit drier than others. The crops weren't getting enough water as they needed, and they needed some way to control this water. So therefore, they built the Cochiti Dam. So this is an aerial picture of the Cochiti Dam, and you can see that it basically is a big wall that holds back water. So in the back here, you can see the Rio Grande coming down and flowing through, and then hits this wall and creates a lake and creates a big backlog of water. And at the very bottom of this wall, there is a hole for water to come through. And in this hole, they can stop water, they can release more water, so they can kind of control the flow of what the water will be like and what the river will be below the dam. So you can see there's still water coming out, but it's very different from what it was above the dam. And also we built dams because we can use the water for energy and to make energy for our homes and our businesses and many things like that, which is another reason why dams were implemented. So now that we have our dam in place, let's kind of look a little bit more at how it works. So I have a simple graphic here that we're going to talk about for how a dam works. So we have our direction of water going from one side to the other, and then we have our dam in the middle, which is, like I said, basically a giant wall that still has an outlet of water at the very bottom of it that can be controlled. So we have the stream coming in, or the river coming in, and then it's going out on the other side. And then as time goes on, that water is going to continue flowing. However, not as much water is going to get released. So water is still continuously flowing into the dam, but not as much is flowing out of it. So it's going to continue building and building and building, and maybe at this point they notice, okay, there's a lot of water behind the dam, let's release a little bit more of it. But it's very structured and very controlled based on the needs of people and what they need for their crops or what they need for their homes, or even drinking water. Those are all reasons why they would control this water flow. And it continues to grow. So now we have our dam in place, which means that less water is flowing through the river because it's being backlogged behind the dam and it's being slowly released down the bosque. So now that there's less water that is flowing through the river and through the bosque, what plants might make their way into this drier environment? Think from before in the Rio Bravo and what plants we had put there. Those plants are the upland shrub, those cacti, the four-winged saltbush, plants that don't need a lot of water to survive and can primarily rely on rainwater, have moved into the bosque because they're no longer getting flooded and washed away or just drowned by the water. They're able to survive in this environment that used to be very wet and now has become a little bit drier. But all of that, we have all of those changes that have been made, like the levees, the ditches, and the jetty jacks, and then Cochiti Dam. And people started to realize, oh, there's some changes happening in our bosque, and we need to look at that. We need to see how all of these changes have affected the health of the bosque, which leads us to 1996 is when the first BEMP monitoring station was installed, which is awesome. So we are able to go out to 33 sites along the bosque, which go all the way from Okeawinge in the north down south to Socorro, and even past that to Las Cruces, which is awesome. So we have a huge span of area that we are collecting data from. And we are collecting data on the leaves. We're looking at the water, the arthropods that are in there, and even more, just the general tree health. We're looking at the ecosystem as a whole. And a lot of this data is collected by students, which is awesome. In this top photo here, we have two students that are collecting some leaves so that we can see when leaves are falling from trees, how much leaves are falling from trees, what kind of leaves are falling from trees, all of that kind of stuff. In this lower picture here, we have some of our BEMP staff that actually is installing a site. And this is a site installation in the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in the bosque there. And here they are putting in a groundwater well, so we can see how much water is below us and in the aquifer. And then in this last photo here, that actually is me, and I am measuring one of those groundwater wells to see how much water we have gotten. And you could see that it actually had flooded this year, so I can see how much water is above ground, and then I'm seeing how much water is below ground as well. So those are all some things that BEMP does when we are monitoring the bosque. So now we have our BEMP sites that are added to our model. So now there's something missing that we had talked about from the very first one, and that is animals. A lot of the animals have stayed fairly consistent. We still have different kinds of birds. We have coyotes and roadrunners and lizards. One of the things that has really changed though is the fish. We still have silvery minnow in our river, but there are a lot less of them. They are an endangered species now because there's a lot less water in the river, and silvery minnow really rely on having maybe some side channels that they like to go in, and definitely just that braided shape to be able to reproduce to make more silvery minnow fish. So other animals that have been introduced to the area since people had started coming in more, and particularly the Europeans have started coming in more, were animals like roly-polies. Those are actually an invasive species. We have bullfrogs that are new here, some different kinds of finches. This one is a house finch. And then we also have other fish that have been introduced into the river, like carp. Other species of trout have been introduced as well. Having different fish species and other exotic animals in general have made it hard for the native animals here to really survive as well as they possibly could, because now they're having to compete with other animals that haven't necessarily been here for a long time. And so they're starting to conflict with that, and they're starting to have to use some of the same resources, which might not be good for some of the native animals here, but a lot of the invasive species are able to just come into the space and use it however they would like. So now what I want to look at is what changes do you see from the past river to the present river? So on the left-hand side here, I have the past, which is our Rio Bravo, and then on the other side of the screen, I have our present, which is our Rio Manso. I had to flip them so that you can fully see both of them to compare, but I think you'll still be able to see the changes between them. So what changes do you see from before to our present time? And then thinking forward, what changes do you think can be done on your own and as a community to help the river look more like it did in the past? And then a question that goes with that as well is, do you think we even should make it look like it did in the past? Or should it look completely different? Should it look the same? These are questions I want to leave you with before our next session. So going back to these two photos here, we have our past photo, we have our recent photo, and then we're kind of going to look at what the future looks like. So in our next lesson, which is called the Rio Nuevo, we're going to look at what changes can be made in the Bosque or should be made in the Bosque to see what it might look like in the future. So I want to leave you with that to think about before you complete the next lesson is, what do you think the future should look like, what it can look like, all those kind of things, and what can be done to make any of those changes you think of. So thank you for bumping with me, and I hope to see you in our next lesson. Thank you.